The receptionist looked at me like I was invisible, then slid the clipboard across the mahogany desk toward Margaret, my wife of 32 years. "We need your mother's signature here," she said, tapping a manicured fingernail against the highlighted line. "The patient's guardian needs to sign." I was 68 years old. My mother had been dead for 15 years. And somehow, in this moment, I didn't exist as an adult capable of making decisions for my own wife, who sat slumped in her wheelchair, barely able to keep her eyes open after her stroke. The smell of industrial disinfectant burned my nostrils as my cheeks flushed hot with humiliation. All the documents I'd collected over our life together, our marriage certificate, power of attorney, advance healthcare directives, might as well have been blank sheets of paper. "I am her wife," I said, my voice sounding stronger than I felt. "I have all the legal authority to make decisions for her." The receptionist, Bethany, according to her name tag, looked up at me with the practiced blank stare of someone who'd been trained to handle difficult people. "I'm sorry, but our system shows Linda Harrington as the authorized contact and next of kin. We can't proceed without her signature." Linda, my mother-in-law, who had disowned Margaret 35 years ago when she came out. The woman who had refused to attend our wedding and returned every birthday and Christmas card unopened. That Linda was somehow still listed as Margaret's next of kin at Ridgeview Medical Center, the best stroke rehabilitation facility in Minnesota. I clutched my leather portfolio tighter against my chest, the corner of our marriage certificate digging into my palm through the leather. "There must be some mistake," I insisted, pulling out the stack of carefully organized documents I'd assembled after Margaret's stroke 3 days earlier. The medical power of attorney was on top, notarized, and recently updated after my own heart scare last year. "We've been legally married since 2015. I have all the documentation right here." Bethany barely glanced at the papers. I placed before her, "I understand, ma'am, but our system clearly shows Mrs. Harrington as the designated contact. These documents would need to be verified by our legal department before we can make any changes, and that process takes 7 to 10 business days. If you want your wife to begin rehabilitation immediately, we need Mrs. Harrington's signature." I'll never forget what happened next. How Margaret, barely able to speak clearly since the stroke, mustered enough strength to grab my wrist and say with perfect clarity, "Call her." In that moment, I knew our nightmare was just beginning. I hadn't spoken to Linda Harrington in over 3 decades. The last time I'd heard her voice was at Margaret's father's funeral in 1992, when she'd loudly told a cousin that Margaret would be welcome at home if she'd just give up this lesbian nonsense. Now here I was, dialing her number from the sterile family consultation room at Ridgeview, my hands trembling so badly I had to redial twice. I kept seeing Margaret's face, confused, exhausted, still partially paralyzed on her left side, as they'd wheeled her back to a temporary room to wait. "She needs to start therapy today," the doctor had emphasized. "Every day of delay decreases her chances of full recovery." I'll tell you exactly what Linda said when she finally answered, but first, let me back up and explain how Margaret and I built a life together, and how someone who should have been nothing but a painful memory suddenly held my wife's future in her hands. Margaret and I met in 1988 at Powell's Bookstore in Minneapolis. I was 31, recently promoted to head librarian at the university, browsing the literature section during my lunch break. Margaret was 33, a brilliant architect with her own small firm, reaching for the same first edition of Virginia Woolf's To the Lighthouse. Our fingers touched, and I felt that electric current people always talk about but I'd never believed in before. "You take it," she said, smiling with these incredible dimples I can still picture perfectly. I insisted she should have it, and somehow we ended up sharing a coffee in the store's little cafe, talking about books and buildings and how light changes the way we experience a space. 3 hours later, I was late getting back to work, and we'd made plans for dinner that Friday. I remember walking back to the library, feeling like my feet weren't quite touching the ground. Those early years weren't easy. It was the late 80s and early 90s. And while Minneapolis had a vibrant queer community, we still faced plenty of challenges. Margaret's family situation was particularly difficult. Her parents were wealthy, conservative Catholics from Medina. Her father owned a successful construction company that had built half the shopping centers in the Twin Cities area. When Margaret came out to them in 1986, years before we met. Her mother Linda had thrown a Bible at her and told her to get out of the house until she fixed herself. Her father, Joseph, had been slightly less dramatic but equally firm. He froze her trust fund and told her that her lifestyle choice meant she was no longer welcome at family gatherings. Margaret had rebuilt her life without their support, starting her own architecture firm and making a name for herself designing energy-efficient public buildings. She rarely spoke about her family, but I knew the estrangement wounded her deeply. I'll share with you the one memento she kept from her childhood home, and how it later became crucial evidence in our fight. We built a beautiful life together in our craftsman-style home in the Seward neighborhood. Margaret's architecture business thrived. She eventually had a team of 12 architects and designers working for her. I became the director of the university library system. We had a wide circle of friends, traveled extensively, and were actively involved in local politics and LGBTQ advocacy work. In 2015, when marriage equality finally became legal nationwide, we were among the first couples at the courthouse. I still remember the date, June 28, 2015, and how Margaret cried when the officiant pronounced us legally married after 27 years together. "No one can deny us now," she whispered as we signed the certificate. We updated all our legal documents immediately: wills, powers of attorney, advance directives, making each other the sole decision-makers in case of emergency. We thought we'd covered every base, protected ourselves from any possible challenge. We were so certain we'd done everything right. We celebrated our 30th anniversary in 2018 with a river cruise through Europe, something we'd always wanted to do. 2 weeks floating from Amsterdam to Budapest, visiting Christmas markets and medieval cathedrals, drinking mulled wine on the deck as snow dusted the shorelines. Margaret took hundreds of photographs. She'd developed a passion for photography in her 60s and had quite a talent for it. There's one picture she took of me on that trip, standing on the deck with the lights of Vienna twinkling behind me, that I still keep on my nightstand. We were so happy, so content with the life we'd built together. We had no idea that in just a few years, everything would change. The first sign came in April 2021. Margaret was working in her home office when she called out to me. Her voice sounded strange, slurred, almost. When I rushed in, she was staring at her computer screen, trying to speak but unable to form the words. Her coffee mug had slipped from her hand, dark liquid seeping into the beige carpet. I called 911 immediately, recognizing the signs of a stroke from the awareness campaign we'd both donated to the previous year. The paramedics arrived within minutes, and Margaret was rushed to University Medical Center. She recovered almost completely from that first minor stroke, a warning shot, the doctors called it. They adjusted her medications, recommended some lifestyle changes, and sent us home with pamphlets about stroke prevention. We followed every instruction meticulously, believing we could control what happened next. For the next 2 years, we adapted to our new normal. Margaret scaled back her work hours and brought in a younger partner to take over the more stressful aspects of running the firm. I retired from my position at the university but kept teaching one graduate seminar each semester to stay active. We walked together every morning, switched to a Mediterranean diet, and Margaret took her medications religiously, 5 pills each morning and 3 at night, organized in those little plastic containers marked with the days of the week. On February 14, 2023, we celebrated Valentine's Day at our favorite restaurant, Late Well. Margaret seemed tired that evening, but insisted she felt fine. When she knocked over her water glass, reaching for the bread basket, we both laughed it off as clumsiness. I wonder now if I should have noticed something was wrong, if I could have prevented what happened next. Would you have seen the signs I missed? The major stroke hit the following morning. I found Margaret on the bathroom floor, unable to move her left side, her speech completely garbled. This time, I didn't just call 911. I called our primary care physician, Dr. Abrams, who met us at the emergency room. The next 48 hours were a blur of tests, specialists, and terrible fluorescent lighting. Margaret was stabilized, but the damage was extensive. The neurologist, Dr. Chen, explained that she would need intensive rehabilitation to regain function. The first 2 weeks are critical, she emphasized, tapping her pen against her clipboard. We need to get her into a specialized rehab facility as soon as possible. I nodded. already making mental lists of what needed to be done, which documents to gather, which facility would be best. Dr. Chen recommended Ridgeview Medical Center, known for their excellent stroke rehabilitation program. I made the call that afternoon, scheduled the intake for February 17th, and spent the night gathering every piece of documentation I thought we might need. I was so focused on Margaret's medical situation that I never thought to check who was listed as her emergency contact or next of kin in various medical systems. Why would I? We'd been legally married for 8 years. We'd updated all our documents. I was listed as her emergency contact at her regular doctor's office. But hospital systems are vast and complex, with records that sometimes date back decades. Apparently, Margaret had been treated at Ridgeview once before, back in 1984, long before we met for a skiing accident. Linda Harrington had been listed as her next of kin then, and somehow, despite all the changes in medical record systems over 4 decades, that information had persisted. Now, that outdated information was being used to deny my right to make decisions for my wife. I'll show you exactly how that oversight became the weapon Linda would use against us. So there I was in the family consultation room at Ridgeview, calling a woman who had rejected her own daughter for loving me. My hand shook as I held the phone, listening to it ring once, twice, 3 times. Just as I was about to hang up, thinking I'd have to try a different approach, she answered. Hello. The voice was older, raspier than I remembered, but still unmistakably Linda Harrington, the same clipped, Midwestern accent, the same authoritative tone. I took a deep breath. Linda, this is Catherine Wilson, Margaret's wife. A long silence followed, and I thought maybe she'd hung up. Then, what do you want? No recognition, no softening, just 3 cold words. Margaret has had a severe stroke, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. She's at Ridgeview Medical Center, and they need your signature to admit her to the rehabilitation program because you're somehow still listed as her next of kin from the 1980s. Another long pause, and I could hear paper rustling in the background. Was she taking notes? Looking at a calendar. I'll be there in an hour, she finally said, and hung up without another word. I sat there, clutching the phone, feeling a complex mix of relief and dread. Margaret would get the treatment she needed. That was what mattered most. But at what cost? I went back to Margaret's temporary room, where she lay with her eyes closed, her breathing shallow. The left side of her face was still drooping, and her left arm lay limp on the white hospital blanket. I took her right hand in mine and squeezed gently. Her eyes fluttered open, and she tried to smile. She's coming, I said softly. Margaret's eyes widened in understanding, and a single tear rolled down her cheek. I wiped it away with my thumb. It's going to be okay, I promised. Not knowing if I was lying. True to her word, Linda Harrington arrived at Ridgeview exactly 1 hour later. At 75, she was still an imposing figure, tall, thin, impeccably dressed in a navy blue pantsuit, her silver hair cut in an expensive-looking bob. I was waiting in the lobby when she walked in, and our eyes met across the room. For a moment, neither of us moved. Then she walked directly to the reception desk, ignoring me completely. I'm Linda Harrington, she announced to Bethany, who seemed to materialize from nowhere. I understand you need my signature for my daughter Margaret. Bethany nodded eagerly, producing the clipboard with the admission forms. Right this way, Mrs. Harrington, she said, leading Linda to a small table in the corner of the lobby. I followed, unwilling to be excluded. I'm coming too, I said firmly. Linda looked at me for the first time, her eyes cold and appraising. She didn't object, however, and Bethany seemed uncomfortable but didn't stop me. I watched as Linda read through the forms carefully, her reading glasses perched on the end of her nose. She signed each highlighted line with a flourish, using an expensive-looking fountain pen she pulled from her purse. When she finished the last form, she looked up at Bethany. I'd like to see my daughter now, she said, and it wasn't a request. Bethany glanced at me uncertainly. Of course, she said after a moment. Both of you can come this way. I will never forget walking down that hospital corridor with Linda Harrington, the tension between us so thick it felt like a physical presence. We didn't speak, didn't even look at each other. When we reached Margaret's room, Linda hesitated for just a moment before pushing the door open. Margaret was awake, her bed adjusted so she was sitting up slightly. When she saw her mother, her right hand clutched at the blanket. Linda approached the bed slowly, taking in Margaret's condition with an expression I couldn't read. "Margaret," she said simply. Margaret struggled to speak, managing only a mum. The word hung in the air between them, loaded with 35 years of silence and pain. What happened next would set in motion a battle I never expected to fight. Linda placed her hand on Margaret's arm, the first contact between mother and daughter in over 3 decades. "I'm going to take care of everything," she said, her voice suddenly gentle. "You just focus on getting better." She turned to me, her expression hardening. "I'll need copies of all her medical information forwarded to me. I'll be making decisions about her care from now on." The shock must have shown on my face because she added, almost smugly, "I am her mother. And apparently, I'm still her legal next of kin, according to this facility." I opened my mouth to protest, to point out our marriage, the power of attorney documents, but Margaret's monitor started beeping rapidly as her heart rate spiked. A nurse hurried in, asking us both to step out while she checked on Margaret. In that moment of crisis, I let Linda walk away without challenging her, not realizing she was already putting a plan into action. "I promise I'll tell you exactly what that plan entailed and how I discovered it. But first you need to understand just what was at stake for both of us." The rehabilitation program at Ridgeview was Margaret's best chance at recovery. Dr. Chen had explained that intensive therapy started within the first week after a stroke could significantly improve outcomes. The program cost $2,300 per week and typically lasted 6 to 8 weeks, with insurance covering about 70% of the cost. Margaret and I had the financial resources to handle our portion without difficulty. We'd planned well for retirement and potential health crises. What I didn't know then was that Linda had been monitoring Margaret's career and financial status from afar for years. Through family connections and social circles she had never really left behind. Linda knew about Margaret's successful architecture firm, the property we owned, our investments, and I would soon discover that Linda had her own reasons for suddenly reappearing in her daughter's life after decades of absence. The day after Linda signed the admission forms, Margaret was transferred to the rehabilitation wing of Ridgeview. I arrived early that morning with a small suitcase containing her comfortable clothes, toiletries, and a framed photo of us from our anniversary trip. When I reached her new room, I found Linda already there, speaking with a doctor I hadn't met before. "Ah, Miss Wilson," the doctor said, extending his hand. "I'm Dr. Reynolds, the rehabilitation director. Mrs. Harrington and I were just discussing Margaret's treatment plan." I shook his hand automatically, trying to process the fact that Linda had somehow gotten there before visiting hours even started. "Margaret is my wife," I corrected gently but firmly. "We've been married for 8 years. Dr. Reynolds nodded uncomfortably. "Of course. Well, we've scheduled Margaret for her first physical therapy session at 10 a.m., followed by speech therapy at 11:30. Linda smiled thinly. "I've taken the liberty of requesting copies of all Margaret's medical records and test results," she said, gesturing to a folder on the bedside table. "I want to make sure we're exploring all possible treatment options." The "we" grated on my nerves, but I focused on Margaret, who was watching this exchange with evident anxiety. I moved to her side, taking her right hand in mine. "How are you feeling today, love?" I asked. She squeezed my hand weakly and managed to say, "Tired." Dr. Reynolds excused himself, promising to check in after the first therapy session. Once he was gone, Linda turned to me with an expression that made my blood run cold. "Catherine," she said, as if testing out my name for the first time, "I think we should talk privately." I didn't want to leave Margaret, but she nodded slightly, so I followed Linda into the hallway. "I've consulted with the hospital's legal department," she said without preamble. "While you may have certain documents, the fact is that I am still listed as Margaret's next of kin in their system. Rather than create a complicated legal situation that would only delay Margaret's treatment, I suggest we come to an arrangement." I crossed my arms, immediately wary. "What kind of arrangement?" Linda glanced around to ensure no one was within earshot. "I will allow your involvement in Margaret's care, but I will be the primary decision-maker. After all, I am her mother, and blood is thicker than water." The audacity of her statement left me momentarily speechless. "Allow my involvement," I finally managed, keeping my voice low but intense. "Linda, We have been estranged from you for 35 years because you rejected Margaret for who she is. You have no right to suddenly appear and claim authority over her life. Linda's expression didn't change, and yet, here we are. I have the legal standing in this facility. You can fight me on this, but that will only hurt Margaret in the long run. Delaying her treatment while lawyers argue could impact her recovery permanently. She was right about one thing. Margaret couldn't afford any delays in treatment. I felt trapped, forced to choose between asserting our rights and ensuring Margaret got immediate care. Fine, I said finally. For now, but I'm going to sort this out. Linda nodded, satisfied. I'm sure you'll try, she said, walking back into Margaret's room without waiting for my response. I stood in the hallway, feeling like I'd just made a deal with the devil. Over the next few days, I watched helplessly as Linda inserted herself into every aspect of Margaret's care. She charmed the nurses with stories about her daughter, bringing them homemade cookies and asking detailed questions about the treatment protocols. She scheduled meetings with therapists without including me and requested changes to Margaret's medication regimen. When I tried to assert myself, staff members would give me sympathetic looks but deferred to Linda's instructions. Mrs. Harrington authorized this, they would say, or, we have Mrs. Harrington's approval for the schedule change. I began documenting everything, keeping a small notebook where I recorded dates, times, names, and exact statements. I knew I would need evidence if this continued, and I made sure to spend as much time as possible with Margaret, reassuring her that I was working on a solution. A week into Margaret's rehabilitation, I noticed something odd in the visitor log at the nurses' station. Linda had been there on February 22nd from 7 p.m. to 8:30 p.m., times when I wasn't present because I'd gone home to shower and change clothes. What struck me as strange was the other names signed in during that exact time frame. James Harrington, attorney at law. A quick internet search on my phone revealed that James was Linda's nephew, Margaret's cousin, who specialized in estate law. Why would an estate lawyer be visiting Margaret? The sick feeling in my stomach intensified when I recalled how Margaret's speech therapy was progressing. She could now form simple sentences, though with effort, and her comprehension seemed mostly intact despite the stroke. I didn't mention my discovery to Linda when I saw her the following day. Instead, I watched her more closely, noting how she would frequently check her phone and step out into the hallway to take calls. Once, I managed to overhear a fragment of conversation. Yes, the power of attorney should be ready by next week. She can sign with her right hand. I felt a chill run through me. They were planning to have Margaret sign a new power of attorney, giving Linda control over more than just her medical decisions. I needed to act quickly, but I had to be strategic. Fighting Linda directly might backfire, especially if she convinced the hospital staff that I was causing problems for Margaret's recovery. I needed allies and evidence. I decided to start with Dr. Abrams, our primary care physician who had known us for over 15 years. Dr. Abrams was outraged when I explained the situation. During an urgent appointment I'd scheduled at her office. "This is absurd," she said, shaking her head. "I have all your legal documentation in Margaret's file. You are unquestionably her legal next of kin and medical decision maker." She typed rapidly on her computer, pulling up Margaret's electronic health records. "I'm going to send an official letter to Ridgeview today, clarifying your legal status and enclosing copies of all relevant documents. This should never have happened." Her support was a tremendous relief, but I knew we needed more. "Do you think they're trying to get Margaret to sign new documents while she's vulnerable?" I asked. Dr. Abrams frowned deeply. "If that's the case, it would be highly unethical, possibly even illegal. A patient who has suffered a significant stroke may not have the capacity to fully understand legal documents, especially complicated ones like a power of attorney." She promised to include a statement about Margaret's current capacity in her letter to Ridgeview. Armed with Dr. Abrams' support, I reached out to our lawyer, Diane Rodriguez, who had helped us update all our legal documents after our marriage. Diane was equally appalled by the situation and immediately began preparing a formal legal notice to both Ridgeview and Linda Harrington. "We need to establish a paper trail," she explained during our meeting at her downtown office. "I'm sending a cease and desist letter to Linda. specifically prohibiting her from attempting to have Margaret sign any legal documents while she's in recovery. I'm also requesting a meeting with Ridgeview's legal department to address their failure to recognize your legal status. Diane looked at me seriously. Across her desk, Catherine, I have to ask, do you think Linda has financial motivations here? The question hit me like a physical blow, though I'd been secretly wondering the same thing. Margaret's architecture firm is quite valuable, I said slowly. And we own several properties, including a vacation home in Door County. But Linda has never shown any interest in Margaret's success before. Why now? Diane tapped her pen against her legal pad. People can become motivated by money, especially as they age and face their own mortality. Is Linda wealthy? Has her financial situation changed recently? I realized I knew almost nothing about Linda's current circumstances. Margaret's father had been wealthy when he died, but that was 30 years ago. What had happened to Linda in the decades since? I made a mental note to do some research. I'll look into it, I promised Diane. In the meantime, what else can we do to protect Margaret? Diane recommended placing a trusted friend or staff member with Margaret at all times when I couldn't be there, someone who could politely but firmly prevent any attempts to have her sign documents. We should also notify the nursing staff and therapy team about your concerns, she added. Many healthcare professionals are trained to recognize potential elder abuse or exploitation. The word exploitation made my stomach clench, but I knew Diane was right. This was no longer just about medical decisions. I was genuinely concerned that Linda was trying to take advantage of Margaret's vulnerable state for financial gain. I left Diane's office with a clear action plan and a renewed determination to protect my wife. What I didn't realize was that Linda was already one step ahead of me. When I arrived at Ridgeview that afternoon, I found Margaret's room empty. Panic surged through me until a nurse informed me that Linda had authorized a special consultation with a neurologist from another hospital. They should be back within the hour, the nurse assured me. Mrs. Harrington said it was a second opinion she'd arranged. I hadn't been informed, hadn't consented to this consultation, and had no idea who this neurologist was or what their qualifications might be. I paced the room, growing increasingly anxious until Margaret was finally wheeled back in by an orderly, with Linda walking alongside the wheelchair. Margaret looked exhausted, her face drawn and pale. What happened? I demanded, rushing to Margaret's side. Where did you take her? Linda gave me a cold smile. Dr. Patel is a renowned neurologist who specializes in stroke recovery. He's agreed to consult on Margaret's case. I helped the orderly transfer Margaret back to her bed, noting how she winced in pain during the movement. You should have informed me, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. I'm her wife and healthcare proxy. Linda waved her hand dismissively. It was a last-minute opportunity. Dr. Patel had a cancellation in his schedule. She turned to the orderly. Thank you, Kevin. That will be all. Once we were alone with Margaret, Linda pulled a folder from her designer handbag. Dr. Patel has recommended some adjustments to Margaret's treatment plan. I've already discussed them with Dr. Reynolds, and he agrees they're worth trying. I took the folder but didn't open it. Margaret needs to rest now, I said firmly. We can discuss treatment changes later. Margaret's right hand reached for mine, squeezing weakly. I could see she wanted to speak but was too tired to form the words. Linda looked like she wanted to object, but something in my expression must have warned her not to push. Fine. I have some calls to make anyway. I'll be back this evening. After she left, I sat beside Margaret, gently stroking her hair until she fell asleep. Then I opened the folder and began reading Dr. Patel's record. Most seemed reasonable, even potentially beneficial, but one stood out. A recommendation to transfer Margaret to a different facility in Edina, coincidentally, the wealthy suburb where Linda still lived, for more specialized care. The transfer would mean starting over with new doctors, new therapists, in a location much less convenient for me to visit regularly. It would also potentially reset the legal battle over who had decision-making authority. I took a photo of every page in the folder with my phone, then carefully returned everything exactly as it had. Then, I knew I needed to act quickly before Linda could implement this transfer plan. That evening, I put the first phase of our counter-strategy into action. Andrea, our closest friend and Margaret's business partner, agreed to take shifts sitting with Margaret when I couldn't be there. No one gets her to sign anything, Andrea promised grimly. And I'll record everything on my phone if anyone tries. Meanwhile, I emailed Dr. Reynolds, formally requesting a meeting with him and his administrative team to review Margaret's case and clarify the legal decision-making authority. I attached copies of our marriage certificate, medical power of attorney, and a statement from Dr. Abrams. I also reached out to the hospital's patient advocate office, explaining the situation and requesting their intervention. These were all official channels, following proper protocols, exactly what Diane had advised. But I also began a more unofficial investigation into Linda Harrington's current circumstances. Social media provided the first clues. While Linda herself wasn't active online, her country club in Edina regularly posted photos from events. In several recent pictures, Linda appeared at charity galas and luncheons, always expensively dressed, but I noticed always wearing the same few outfits and jewelry pieces. Her home, glimpsed in the background of some photos, was the same large Tudor-style house where Margaret had grown up, but public property records showed a second mortgage had been taken out 3 years earlier. Most tellingly, an article in the Minneapolis Business Journal from 6 months ago mentioned that the Harrington Family Foundation was restructuring due to financial challenges. I remembered that Joseph Harrington had established that foundation with his construction fortune before he died. If the foundation was in trouble, perhaps Linda's financial situation wasn't as secure as she wanted people to believe. The next piece of the puzzle came from an unexpected source. Kevin, the orderly who had brought Margaret back from the consultation with Dr. Patel, stopped me in the hallway 2 days later. "Ms. Wilson, can I talk to you for a minute?" He looked nervous, glancing around to make sure no one was listening. "That neurologist appointment, it wasn't just a medical consultation." He lowered his voice further. "There was another guy there, looked like a lawyer. He had papers with him. The old lady, Mrs. Harrington, she tried to get your wife to sign something, but the doctor stopped it, said it wasn't appropriate given her condition." My blood ran cold. "Kevin, would you be willing to write that down? It could be really important." He hesitated, then nodded. "I can do better." I recorded part of it on my phone. That lady was being so pushy, I just had a bad feeling. He pulled out his phone and played a short audio clip. Linda's voice was unmistakable. "Margaret, dear, this is just a standard form that gives me temporary authority to handle your affairs while you're recovering. Just sign at the bottom." Then a male voice, presumably Dr. Patel's, "Mrs. Harrington, I don't think this is appropriate during a medical consultation. The patient needs to rest now." Kevin's evidence was exactly what we needed. Proof that Linda was attempting to have Margaret sign legal documents without my knowledge, during what was supposed to be a medical appointment. I asked him to send me the audio file and to meet with Diane to provide a formal statement. He agreed, though I could tell he was worried about his job. "Don't worry," I assured him. "You're protected as a whistleblower in this situation, and you're doing the right thing." I gave him Diane's contact information, then hurried to Margaret's room to tell Andrea what I'd learned. We needed to accelerate our plans before Linda could make another attempt. The meeting with Dr. Reynolds and the hospital administration was scheduled for the following Monday, 4 days away. Too long to wait, given what I now knew. I decided to confront Linda directly, but in a public setting where she couldn't easily dismiss me or create a scene. The next morning, when she arrived at Ridgeview, carrying a large coffee and her ever-present designer handbag, I was waiting in the hospital cafe. "Linda," I called, waving her over. "Join me for a moment. I've ordered coffee for both of us." She hesitated, then reluctantly sat down across from me. "I have a tight schedule today," she said, checking her expensive watch. "What is it?" I smiled pleasantly, aware of the other patients and visitors at nearby tables. "I wanted to discuss Margaret's progress. The therapists tell me she's doing remarkably well. Her speech is improving daily." Linda nodded stiffly. "Yes, Dr. Reynolds mentioned that yesterday. He thinks she might be ready for more challenging therapy next week." I took a sip of my coffee, then set the cup down carefully. "I'm curious about something. Linda, why did you bring a lawyer to Margaret's appointment with Dr. Patel?" The color drained from her face, but she recovered quickly. "I don't know what you're talking about." I leaned forward slightly. We both know that's not true. You tried to have Margaret sign new legal documents during that appointment, documents that would give you control over her affairs. There were witnesses, Linda, and evidence. Her hand trembled slightly as she reached for her coffee. You're mistaken. James is family, Margaret's cousin. He was simply there for support. James Harrington, attorney at law, I said softly, specializing in estate planning and elder law. An interesting choice for family support. Linda's eyes narrowed. What exactly are you implying, Catherine? I maintained eye contact, keeping my voice level. I'm not implying anything. I'm stating facts. You've been estranged from Margaret for 35 years. Now, suddenly, you're intensely involved in her care and trying to gain legal control over her affairs. I have to wonder why. Linda set down her coffee cup with a sharp click. I'm her mother. That's reason enough. I shook my head slowly. Not after 35 years of silence. Not after refusing to attend our wedding. Not after returning every card and letter unopened. Something's changed, Linda. What is it? Is the Harrington Foundation in financial trouble? The flash of panic in her eyes told me I'd hit a nerve. That's none of your business, she snapped, but her composed facade was cracking. Actually, it is my business when it involves my wife, I replied. I've scheduled a meeting with Dr. Reynolds and the hospital administration for Monday. I'll be presenting our marriage certificate, power of attorney, and other legal documents. I'll also be sharing evidence that you attempted to have Margaret sign new documents without proper consent or legal capacity. I paused, letting the information sink in. Or, we could reach a different arrangement. Linda's eyes narrowed suspiciously. What kind of arrangement? I laid out my terms clearly and firmly. You step back. You acknowledge me as Margaret's legal next of kin and decision maker. You stop interfering with her treatment plan. In return, I won't pursue legal action against you for attempted exploitation of a vulnerable adult. Linda's face flushed with anger. You wouldn't dare. I met her gaze steadily. Try me, Linda. I have spent 32 years loving and protecting your daughter, something you chose not to do. I won't stop now. For a long moment, we sat in tense silence. Then Linda gathered her handbag and stood. This isn't over, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. You have no idea what you're dealing with. As she walked away, I felt a chill of apprehension. I had challenged her directly, and while it had revealed valuable information about her motivations, I knew she wouldn't give up easily. The next few days would be critical. I needed to ensure Margaret was protected around the clock until our meeting with hospital administration on Monday. Andrea and I created a schedule ensuring one of us was with Margaret at all times. We recruited 2 other close friends to help cover the weekend shifts. Meanwhile, Diane worked with Kevin to document his evidence properly and prepared our case for the Monday meeting. I also asked Dr. Abrams to conduct an independent evaluation of Margaret's current cognitive capacity, specifically her ability to understand and sign legal documents. Margaret herself seemed to sense the tension, though I tried to shield her from the worst of it. During our quiet moments alone, I would hold her hand and talk about our plans for when she came home, the garden we would plant in the spring, the trip to Door County we would take once she was stronger. Fight, she would say, one of the words she could now articulate clearly. We fight, and I would kiss her forehead and promise, always, love. Always. Saturday morning brought an unexpected development. I arrived at Ridgeview to find a security guard posted outside Margaret's room. The nurse on duty, Sophia, pulled me aside before I could question him. There was an incident last night, she explained quietly. Mrs. Harrington tried to have Margaret transferred to another facility at 11 p.m., claimed it was an emergency situation. When Andrea refused to leave and started recording on her phone, Mrs. Harrington became agitated. Security was called. I felt a surge of both anger and vindication. What happened then? Sophia lowered her voice further. The nursing supervisor reviewed Margaret's file and found Dr. Abrams' letter stating you were the legal healthcare proxy. She denied the transfer request and asked Mrs. Harrington to leave. Mrs. Harrington threatened to sue the hospital before she left. I thanked Sophia for the information and for the nursing staff's appropriate handling of the situation. The security guard nodded respectfully as I entered Margaret's room. where Andrea was dozing in the visitor's chair. You missed all the excitement, Andrea said after I woke her gently. She looked exhausted but triumphant. Linda showed up with an ambulance crew and transferred papers, said Margaret was being moved to some place called Golden Pines Rehabilitation Center. I recognized the name, an expensive facility in Edina, not far from Linda's home. What exactly happened? I asked, and Andrea filled in the details. Linda had arrived with 2 ambulance attendants and a stack of papers, insisting Margaret needed to be transferred immediately for specialized treatment not available at Ridgeview. When Andrea questioned this and began recording the interaction, Linda had become increasingly hostile, eventually threatening to have Andrea removed for interfering with medical care. The night nursing supervisor, alerted by the commotion, had intervened and ultimately denied the transfer based on Dr. Abrams' letter in Margaret's file. Linda went ballistic, Andrea concluded. Started threatening lawsuits against everyone, the nurse, me, the hospital. Security finally escorted her out. This attempted midnight transfer was a desperate move, and a significant tactical error on Linda's part. It clearly demonstrated her willingness to act against established medical protocols, and without proper authorization. I immediately called Diane to update her on this development, which she agreed. Strengthened our case considerably. This is exactly the kind of evidence we need, she said. It shows a pattern of attempting to circumvent proper procedures and your legal authority. She promised to contact Ridgeview's risk management department immediately, rather than waiting for Monday's meeting. This needs to be addressed now, she insisted. They need to implement formal restrictions on who can authorize Margaret's transfers or treatments. By Saturday afternoon, Ridgeview's legal The BAFTA had issued temporary orders restricting Margaret's care decisions to me alone, pending the full review on Monday. Linda was not explicitly banned from visiting, but any treatment changes or transfer requests from her would be automatically declined. A note to this effect was prominently placed in Margaret's electronic medical record and at the nursing station. I felt a moment of relief, knowing Margaret was safer now, but I still worried about Linda's next move. Someone willing to attempt the midnight hospital transfer might try other desperate tactics. I decided to stay at the hospital overnight, sleeping in the recliner chair beside Margaret's bed. Sunday passed quietly, with no sign of Linda. Margaret had her regular therapy sessions, showing small but encouraging improvements in both speech and left side mobility. By evening, she could form 3-word sentences with effort and move her left fingers slightly. The therapists were pleased with her progress. She's a fighter, the speech therapist told me with an approving nod. Her determination makes a huge difference. I smiled, thinking how Margaret had always approached challenges with the same focused intensity, whether designing an award-winning building or learning to speak again after a stroke. As night fell, I settled into the recliner beside her bed, prepared for another uncomfortable but necessary night at the hospital. I was awakened around 2 a.m. by the sound of Margaret's monitor beeping. She was restless, her right hand plucking at the blanket. "What is it, love?" I whispered, moving to her side. "Did you have a bad dream?" She shook her head slightly, then managed to say, "Phone, your phone." I checked my cell phone and saw several missed calls and text messages from a number I didn't recognize. The most recent text read, "Catherine, this is James Harrington. We need to talk about Aunt Linda. It's urgent. Please call, regardless of the hour. James, Linda's nephew, the estate attorney who had been present during the neurologist appointment. Why would he be contacting me directly, and at this hour?" I showed the message to Margaret, who nodded encouragingly. "Talk," she said. I kissed her forehead. "I'll be right back," I promised, stepping into the hallway to return the call. James answered on the first ring, his voice tense. "Thank you for calling back. I don't have much time." He spoke quickly, the words tumbling out. "Aunt Linda is planning something for tomorrow's meeting. She has falsified documents, old papers with Margaret's signature that she's modified. She's claiming Margaret gave her power of attorney years ago, before your marriage." I leaned against the wall, stunned. "That's fraud," I said. "Yes," James agreed grimly, "and I can't be part of it." I told her I wouldn't present fraudulent documents, and she fired me. "She's hired someone else, someone less scrupulous." He paused, and I could hear him taking a deep breath. "There's More, the Harrington Foundation is essentially bankrupt. Uncle Joseph's investments didn't perform as expected, and Aunt Linda has been living beyond her means for years. The house has multiple mortgages, and she's facing foreclosure. She needs money, Catherine, and she knows Margaret has it. The pieces finally fit together. Linda's sudden reappearance in Margaret's life, her aggressive attempts to gain legal control. It was all about money. Why are you telling me this? I asked. She's your Aunt. James was silent for a moment. Because what she's doing is wrong, and because Margaret is my cousin. We weren't close. Aunt Linda made sure of that after Margaret came out, but I remember her kindness when I was young. She doesn't deserve this. He gave me specific details about the falsified documents Linda planned to present and the name of the lawyer she'd hired to replace him. Be prepared, he warned. Aunt Linda is desperate, and desperate people are dangerous. After we hung up, I immediately called Diane, despite the hour, and relayed everything James had told me. We needed to adjust our strategy for tomorrow's meeting. Monday morning arrived with a palpable tension. Margaret seemed to sense it, holding my hand tightly as I prepared to leave for the meeting. When? She said, looking directly into my eyes. I nodded, throat too tight to speak. The meeting was scheduled for 10 a.m. in the hospital's administrative conference room. Diane arrived early, bringing with her a court reporter, a precaution sheet arranged after hearing about the falsified documents. Everything needs to be on record, she explained. Dr. Reynolds welcomed us somewhat nervously, along with the hospital's chief administrator and their legal counsel. We had just settled into our seats when Linda arrived, accompanied by a sleek-looking man in an expensive suit whom she introduced as Mr. Brennan, my attorney. The atmosphere in the room immediately chilled. Dr. Reynolds began by outlining the purpose of the meeting to clarify the legal decision-making authority for Margaret's care. He acknowledged the conflicting information in their records and the recent incidents that had raised concerns. Then he invited each party to present their case. Diane spoke first, methodically presenting our documentation: the marriage certificate, the healthcare power of attorney executed after our marriage, statements from Dr. Abrams confirming my role as Margaret's healthcare proxy, and evidence of our long-standing relationship. She then addressed the recent incidents, the attempted unauthorized transfer, and the consultation with Dr. Patel, where Linda had tried to have Margaret sign new documents. Kevin had provided a sworn statement, and we played the audio recording he'd made. Mr. Brennan objected to the recording, claiming it had been obtained without consent, but the hospital's attorney overruled him, stating that Minnesota was a one-party consent state for recordings. When it was Linda's turn, she presented exactly what James had warned us about: a power of attorney document allegedly signed by Margaret in 1992, giving Linda authority over her medical and financial decisions. This document was never revoked, Mr. Brennan argued smoothly. It predates any documents signed with Ms. Wilson and remains legally binding. He also presented a letter, supposedly from Margaret's primary care physician in 1992, confirming her capacity at the time of signing. Diane smiled thinly. We anticipated this, she said, producing a folder of her own. We have here the original power of attorney document Margaret executed in 1992, not in favor of her mother, but appointing her then partner, Sarah Beckman, as her healthcare proxy. We also have documentation showing that this was properly superseded by later documents naming me as her healthcare proxy after Sarah and Margaret ended their relationship, and ultimately by the documents naming Catherine after their marriage. The shock on Linda's face was unmistakable. Mr. Brennan leaned over to whisper something to her, but she waved him away impatiently. These could be forgeries, she insisted, gesturing at our documents. Diane's smile widened slightly. Interesting accusation, considering what we discovered about your documents. She turned to the hospital's attorney. We had a forensic document examiner review copies of Mrs. Harrington's alleged power of attorney. They identified multiple inconsistencies indicating digital manipulation specifically. Margaret's signature appears to have been lifted from another document and inserted onto this form. The date has also been altered. She handed over the expert's preliminary report. We're prepared to have this examined by additional experts, if necessary. The hospital's attorney reviewed the report with a deepening frown. These are serious allegations, he said, looking at Linda and Mr. Brennan. If this document has indeed been falsified, there could be legal consequences beyond this dispute. Linda's composure finally cracked. You don't understand, she said, her voice rising. That money belongs to our family. Margaret's father built that fortune, and she has no right to keep it all for herself and her. She couldn't even bring herself to say wife. Mr. Brennan placed a restraining hand on her arm, but she shook it off. I am her mother. That should count for something. The raw emotion in her voice was startling after her previous icy control. Diane responded with calm precision. Mrs. Harrington, you disowned your daughter 35 years ago. You refused all contact. You returned every letter, every card, every attempt at reconciliation. You chose not to attend her wedding. You have, by your own actions, relinquished any moral claim to authority over her life. She turned to the hospital representatives. The legal situation is clear. Catherine Wilson is Margaret's lawfully wedded spouse and designated healthcare proxy. All documentation supports this fact. The attempted midnight transfer and the evidence of falsified documents demonstrate a pattern of deception and potential elder abuse that should be of serious concern to this institution. The hospital's chief administrator spoke for the first time. I believe we have sufficient information to make a determination, he said gravely. Based on the documentation presented and the concerning pattern of behavior described, Ridgeview Medical Center recognizes Catherine Wilson as Margaret Harrington Wilson's legal next of kin and healthcare decision maker. All medical staff will be notified accordingly, and appropriate security measures will be implemented to ensure Ms. Harrington Wilson's care proceeds without further disruption. He turned to Linda. Mrs. Harrington, in light of the allegations regarding falsified documents and the attempted unauthorized transfer, the hospital must restrict your visitation until this matter is fully resolved. You may apply for supervised visitation through our Patient Relations Department if Ms. Harrington Wilson consents. Linda stood abruptly, her face flushed with anger. This isn't over, she said, echoing her words from our cafe confrontation. You'll be hearing from my attorneys. Mr. Brennan gathered their papers quickly, looking uncomfortable. As they turned to leave, Diane spoke one last time. Mrs. Harrington, I should inform you that we've filed a report with Adult Protective Services regarding the attempted exploitation of a vulnerable adult. You may also face charges for document fraud. I suggest you consult with your attorney about your next steps very carefully. Linda paused in the doorway, her shoulders stiff for a moment. I thought she might respond, but she simply walked out, Mr. Brennan following close behind. The aftermath of that meeting brought both relief and sadness. Relief that Margaret was now officially protected from Linda's machinations, but sadness at the final, bitter end to any possibility of reconciliation between mother and daughter. When I returned to Margaret's room and told her what had happened, a single tear rolled down her cheek. Wanted money, only money, she said haltingly. I nodded, holding her hand. I'm sorry, love. I'm so sorry it ended this way. Margaret shook her head slightly. Not your fault. Her choice, always so wise. My Margaret. Even with her speech impaired, she could cut to the heart of the matter. Linda had made her choice 35 years ago and again now. The consequences were hers to bear. In the weeks that followed, Margaret made steady progress in her rehabilitation. By mid-March, she could speak in short but clear sentences and walk short distances with a walker. Her left arm remained weaker than her right, but she had regained significant function. The therapists were impressed with her determination and hard work. She's exceeding our expectations, Dr. Reynolds told me during one of our weekly progress meetings. At this rate, she might be able to return home by early April, with outpatient therapy continuing. Of course, I had been preparing our house for Margaret's return, installing grab bars in the bathroom, rearranging furniture to create clear pathways for her walker, and setting up a temporary bedroom on the first floor so she wouldn't have to navigate stairs. We never heard directly from Linda again. Through Diane, we learned that the Adult Protective Services investigation had proceeded, and Linda was facing potential charges for attempted exploitation. The fraud allegations regarding the falsified documents were also under investigation. James Harrington contacted me once more to apologize for his initial involvement and to let me know that Linda had left Minnesota, supposedly to stay with a cousin in Arizona. I doubt she'll be back anytime soon, he said. The house is being foreclosed on next month. He hesitated, then added, "If Margaret ever wants to talk to me, well, I'd like the chance to know my cousin again." I promised to pass along the message when Margaret was stronger. On April 2, 2023, exactly 45 days after her major stroke, Margaret came home. Our friends had decorated the house with welcome home signs and filled the refrigerator with prepared meals. Andrea had arranged for Margaret's firm to send a huge flower arrangement, spring tulips and daffodils in Margaret's favorite colors of yellow and purple. As I helped her through the front door, Margaret paused, looking around at our familiar living room, with its wall of bookshelves and the large windows that filled the space with light. "Home," she said simply, and the joy in that one word made all the struggles of the past weeks worthwhile. That night, as we sat together on the couch, watching the sunset through those windows, Margaret took my hand and said, "Thank you for fighting." I kissed her fingers gently. "Always," I promised again, "always." The recovery process continued at home, with therapists visiting 3 times a week and regular checkups with Dr. Abrams and the neurologist. There were challenging days. Of course, times when Margaret grew frustrated with her limitations, or when I felt overwhelmed by the responsibilities of caregiving. But there were also moments of profound joy and connection, perhaps even deeper than before the stroke. We didn't take anything for granted anymore. Not a shared cup of coffee in the morning, not the ability to speak each other's names, not the simple pleasure of holding hands while watching our favorite shows. Every small improvement became a cause for celebration. By summer, Margaret was walking with just a cane and speaking incomplete, if sometimes hesitant, sentences. She began working remotely with her architecture firm, initially just reviewing designs and offering feedback, but gradually taking on more active roles. In July, we were able to make that trip to our cottage in Door County, a significant milestone in her recovery. Sitting on the deck overlooking Lake Michigan, Margaret said something that brought tears to my eyes. "This whole thing with my mother, it showed me what real family is. It's not blood, it's choice. It's who stays when things get hard." I couldn't have said it better myself. In the year since Margaret's stroke and our battle with Linda, we've created a new normal for ourselves. Margaret still has some physical limitations. Her left hand will never regain full dexterity, and she tires more easily than before. But her mind is as sharp as ever, and her spirit remains unbroken. We've become advocates for stroke awareness and for LGBTQ+ rights in healthcare, sharing our story to help others prepare better than we did. We've updated and expanded our legal documents, ensuring there can never be any question about our rights or wishes. And we've deepened our connections with the chosen family of friends who stood by us during the crisis. As for Linda, we eventually learned that she had indeed moved to Arizona, where she suffered a heart attack 6 months later. She survived but was left significantly debilitated. In a twist of irony, her cousin, the one she'd gone to stay with, became her guardian and now makes decisions about her care. James keeps us informed occasionally, though neither Margaret nor I have any desire to reconnect with Linda. Sometimes, the healthiest choice is to maintain boundaries, even in difficult circumstances. When James told us about Linda's condition, Margaret was quiet for a long time before saying, "I hope she has someone who fights for her like you fought for me." That's my Margaret, still able to find compassion where I might not. Last month, we celebrated our 35th anniversary, 9 years legally married, 35 years together. We didn't do anything elaborate, just dinner at L'Etoile, where we'd had our last meal before Margaret's stroke. As we raised our glasses in a toast, Margaret said, "To the next 35 years, an optimistic goal at our ages, perhaps, but one I'm certainly willing to strive for." After all, if the past year has taught us anything, it's that nothing is more precious than the time we have with the ones we truly love, the family we choose, the ones who stay, the ones who fight for us when we cannot fight for ourselves. So, what would you do if faced with a similar situation? Would you recognize the warning signs I missed? Would you be prepared with the right documents, the right allies, the right determination to protect your loved one? I hope sharing our story helps someone else avoid the nightmare we experienced. If you know someone who might benefit from hearing this, please share it with them. And if you're facing your own battle right now, remember that you're not alone. There are people who will help you fight. Save this so you remember what to look for. the warning signs, the important documents, the right questions to ask, and never underestimate what you're capable of when protecting someone you love. I'm Catherine Wilson Harrington, recording from Minneapolis, Minnesota. Thank you for listening to our story. If it touched you, please like, subscribe, and leave a comment below. I read them all and would love to hear your thoughts or experiences. Until next time, take care of each other, because in the end, that's what matters most.